Hi everyone, my name is Deborah and this is the Edit by DH. More specifically, this is the Dee Unedited series, episode 2. It's taken me a little bit longer to post this episode only because I've been traveling in Korea. I was there for 1 month, and as you know, when you travel quite far, it takes some time to settle back into your day-to-day life and routine. So here I am. As you know, each episode I cover a topic, and then part 1 is me sharing my experiences, and part 2 is getting a guest on to speak on the same topic but perhaps with a slightly different experience or a slightly different perspective. So today's episode is called the F word. My last episode, the C word, was on children, and for those of you who haven't seen it, episode 1, part 1 and 2 will be linked down below, so please do watch it if you haven't already. On that, I just wanted to say a huge thank you so much to everybody who messaged, privately commented, and I know it's such a sensitive topic. There were so many of you who actually shared quite personal information, which I know is really not easy to do. So thank you so much once again for your words of encouragement and reassurance as well. Today's episode is the F word, like I said, and this episode, the F stands for father. Now, I'll be mainly speaking about my mother being a single parent, but naturally within that, I will be discussing my father. I know I've shared little snippets of information here and there on my posts, so if any of you have been following me for a while, then you will know a bit about my background, but I always just give a summarized version on Instagram post, mainly because there's like a 2,200 character limit, and if I want to waffle on, I can. But it's not the right place to really go into detail about it, so that's why this episode is the place, and I will discuss it in more detail. Just as an FYI, as soon as I was about to start filming, someone starts drilling outside, which is so typical for where I live. Generally, it's super duper quiet, and the second that I'm like, play, someone goes, ooh, let me hammer something, let me bring the drill out. Maybe today we'll have 10 planes go overhead rather than 2. So I've just closed the window for audio purposes. So if you see me progressively getting shinier and sweatier throughout the video, you know why. So where do I start with this topic? It's a topic that I've spoken about so much, and generally I would consider myself to be a very open book, and therefore it's a topic I find not easy to talk about, but I am very open about it. I have shared details publicly about it. At the same time, it's quite a sensitive topic for me. My mum, she travelled to the UK from South Korea in the early to mid 80s, and she came here to study English. There's a part of her that's quite rebellious, but also there's a part of her that's very curious, and even to this day, you know, my mum was born in the 50s. Many people say to her, you were quite ahead of your times. And I think she really was and is in many ways. She was willing to be more daring than a lot of other people, especially in her generation. And I remember she was telling me at the time, in the 50s, she was getting a lot of pressure. She was in her late 20s, mid to late 20s. From mid to late 20s, she started to get a lot of pressure from society and those around her, like, why aren't you marrying? And you know, all her life my mum had really worked hard to actually support her family. So she's the oldest of 5 siblings. There's 3 girls and 2 boys, and because she's the eldest, at one point my granddad, I think, just had some troubles with employment, so my mum really had to be the breadwinner for the family, and that did massively impact her ability to date, her ability to find a suitable partner. And my mum's not a wallflower type of character. She's not like super feminine. She's not like a yes or no sir type of person. She's very independent. She's got her own mind. She's easily can confront someone if she feels like something wrong is being done. In the end, I think because of all the pressure, and in the end because my family were okay financially, she decided that she wanted to travel to the UK to study English. And because she's Christian, she started to attend a Bible school. And that's where she met my biological father. and he's also Korean. So before I give you more information about him, I'll just continue with the story chronologically. So my mum met my father, and at the time, in that generation, you don't date people for a long time. There's no such thing as like you're in a relationship with someone for like a year to 5 years plus and you don't marry, or you live together, or you even date for a long time. You would literally date a few times, like literally a handful of times, and then you would make a decision whether you would want to marry that person. And they decided they wanted to marry, so they did. And then shortly after, my mum got pregnant with me and had me in 1986. So if you really think about it, in that generation, you were essentially marrying a stranger because you really don't know each other. And when you live with one another, you learn things about your partner. Great things, there's things that you might fall more in love with them about, and then there's things that will make you see them in a different light. And unfortunately, in that generation, I know there's lots of marriages that have survived, but at the same time, it was also kind of a recipe for disaster as well. So after getting married, having me, my mum is a very, what can I say? She's very sensible with money. She always has been. And she had quite a good career in Korea, good job in Korea. And she had saved quite a considerable amount of money. Even being the breadwinner and supporting her family back in Korea, she still managed to save, because she was very much like not really generous with herself. My mum's very, very, very good with money, like I said. So she doesn't buy a lot. She's, like I said, she's not girly, so she wasn't into like clothes, makeup, all of that. So she managed to save a considerable amount. She came to the UK with money. She came to the UK with a degree. So she, again, which was very, very rare for those times, she had gotten a degree in agriculture. And at the time, the university that she went to was very known for that subject. And she was like, I think there were 2 women in the entire school, with the majority being men. So she came to the UK, educated with a degree, savings, met my dad, married him, had me. And then slowly my father started to kind of dip into my mum's money. Sometimes it would be for the generosity of other people, like he would try and pay for other people. But at the end of the day, it was still my mum's money, and it was really for our future. But whether my dad did it like knowingly or unknowingly, he just accessed the money to the point where it's almost like dwindled to nothing. And around the age of 2, when I was 2 years old, my mum said that my dad just suddenly left one day and never came back. I've shared this before, but like imagine a situation where that happens. I don't know if any of you have partners, I don't know if any of you are married, but imagine just living your day-to-day life and your routine, and your partner goes to work or goes out to meet somebody, just goes out for the day. Well, that's what you think. And then they never come back to your house, or they never come back to you again. And that's what happened with my mum. So she thought my dad was missing for a long time. She didn't know what to think. And that's natural. You would think the worst. You would think that someone's missing, perhaps they're dead. God forbid what, you don't know what's happened to them. And, it was to the point where she wanted to reach out to Interpol to find out where my dad was, because she genuinely was concerned about him. And then one day he just contacted her out of the blue and asked for a divorce. So that was the first communication that she got from my dad, which was to ask for a divorce. I think it was actually like a solicitor's letter that she got first, and then my dad contacted her by phone. My mum, like I said, she's a very strong woman. She's very, very independent. And she just remembered begging him to stay, begging him to change his mind, at least for the sake of me, his child, their child. And my dad was adamant that he wouldn't change his mind. I was like, no. And my mum begged him, please, 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 if it's not for me, please do it for Deborah. And apparently he said, if you can't manage her, then just give her up to an orphanage, which I found out obviously way later on in my life, way later on in my life. But that has always stayed with me for obvious reasons. The first time I heard it, it was very, very hard to hear, as you can imagine, but that is what he said. I mean, that is what he said. What can I say about it? So even though my mum begged him, he refused to stay and his mind was set. So it took my mum so many years to really get over it, because really, even to this day, she doesn't have closure about it. I would say she's better now, but occasionally when we speak about stuff that still makes her look back, and particularly were hard times or traumatic for her, she still gets quite emotional. And my mum is not like an overly emotional person. Like, she doesn't cry easily, you know, complete opposite of me, but she would still have moments where she would get emotional and break down, and that tells me that, you know, she still doesn't have closure around it, and how can she? I will add more information later on, so I hope it's making sense so far, but I want to really go about this in a chronological way, or in the way that kind of makes sense to me. So after my dad left us, my mum's savings was zero. He had pretty much used all her savings, and he left us homeless. And she was this lady who had come from a foreign country. She could barely speak English, because obviously Korean's her first language. She was really struggling with English. She's been left with a young baby to look after by herself, and my mum absolutely could have given me up, especially during those times. And to be honest with you, thinking about it objectively, I think if my mum had given me up for adoption, and knowing the story that I do now, I don't think I would have blamed her in the slightest for giving me up for adoption. I certainly think my mum could have achieved way more as a person if she didn't have me in her life. But at the same time, I'm so grateful that she stood by me and decided to continue to take care of me, and not just willy-nilly. Like, she really committed to trying to be the best mum ever, and she is the best mum ever in my mind. I'm really sorry. I am getting way more emotional about this than I thought I would, which is so strange, because it's something that I've spoken about so openly many times. But I think there's just something about talking specifically about it that's so raw that I just didn't expect this. Anyway, I did say it's Dee Unedited. So yeah, my dad pretty much left us homeless. She wasn't able to speak English properly. She was left with a baby. And, you know, times were really tough, to the point where she had found a church community. If it wasn't for the church, my mum and I would have ended up on the streets, and God knows what would have happened had that been the case. But thankfully, thanks to the church members, they found us like a kind of homeless bedsit that my mum could just stay at for the time being. Money was really scarce, we didn't have a lot of food, and there was a time my mum remembered that she could just about afford like some food. I think it was pizza, and it was like I don't think it was a big pizza, but she just about could manage to afford this. And she hadn't eaten properly, I hadn't eaten properly, and obviously because I'm her priority, like, I just ate it all by myself, because I was a kid and I didn't know any better. Like, I didn't know my mum was hungry too. And that's like how hard times were. And it's just proof of like a mother's love. She was an educated woman. Like I said, she had a degree. But when you've got a starving child, when you're at your rock bottom, there's no such thing as pride. There's no such thing as, but I've got a degree. You just do what you can to earn money, to survive, to get by, to pay the bills, to pay whatever, to put food on the table. And so, you know, my mum did so many jobs. Like, she became a cleaner. She had multiple jobs. She was a cleaner at one point for a long time, where she was cleaning in private people's homes. But also she at one point was working in a restaurant where she was washing dishes. A better job that she had was she worked in a bank, in a Korean bank. But yeah, she had so many different jobs. At one point she worked for Daewoo, which is a Korean company, and she worked as a chef in the kitchen. She had so many different jobs, and during that time she was trying to balance being a mum, trying to balance, you know, not being homeless, putting food on the table, like I said. And she luckily came across this Scottish, I believe she was Scottish solicitor, who helped my mum to apply for a council house. And that really was a turning point for us, because it was like the first official property or home. It was really a home to us for a long time, and it meant a bit of stability. And this same solicitor is the one that helped my mum with acquiring a visa. So till this day, my mum's still so thankful to her. And honestly, if I knew who this person was, if they're still alive, I don't think there's any way possible to even find this person. But if we could, I would love to just thank them from the bottom of my heart, because I don't actually, maybe they were just doing their job, maybe they cared, I don't know. Maybe it was a combination of both, but I don't think this person actually realised how much they impacted our life for the positive, and kind of allowed my mum to have the start that she needed. My mum and I, we then moved into a council flat in northwest London, and that's pretty much where I spent the majority of my childhood. Like, pre that apartment or flat, I have no other memories of living anywhere else. So for me, that's like my childhood memory. And we lived in that flat until I was around, I want to say 18 years old, just before I moved to university. So it was a significant, portion of my life where I lived there. And I have many positive experiences from there, but I also have some not so good experiences, just because it is a council flat. So you can imagine, like, we had some great neighbours, and I still have a childhood friend from there who I'm still like love to pieces. But there were some characters there too, like some shady characters, as you can imagine. But the most important thing is it gave us a base, it gave us security, and it gave us a home. So during this time, my mum worked really hard, and a neighbour would babysit me after school. It allowed my mum to just work longer hours. Growing up, my mum, again, I've spoken about this, was just like a typical, like an Asian tiger mum. We would often clash because she would just care about studies. Like, it was almost like her motto is like study. But again, knowing what I do now, knowing the struggles my mum went through, I think my mum just naturally, like most parents do, they just want their child to have a better life than they did. And especially I feel that's true of like immigrant parents who really struggle in their life to get to this Western country. They genuinely just want their children to do better and be better than they ever were, to have opportunities that they never had. So I remember we clashed a lot. But when I say clash, I don't mean like we would have slanging matches. No. Unless I wanted a big wallop, I wouldn't dare, shout back, especially when I was younger. But it was tough because I didn't want to study. Like, I wanted to be out, playing with my friends, but my mum would like have organised piano lessons for me after school, or like maths tutoring, and then on the weekends I would have to go to ballet and things like that. And I really resented that, because I was like, I just want to go outside and have ice cream with my friends and play around in the mud. But now, again, in hindsight, being an adult and knowing what I know now, I'm so grateful that she gave me those opportunities where she invested more in me, because it was an investment. I mean, to be fair, I've forgotten pretty much how to play piano, even though I played till grade 5. And I'm definitely not as flexible as I used to be with the ballet thing. But they were character shaping, and it did make me appreciate arts more. And, in a way, she really nurtured my creative side in that aspect. So I am grateful for it now. And yeah, we just lived in this house, in this flat for a long time, like I said. And then at some point my mum became a carer for people with learning difficulties, and that became her kind of niche, I guess, her speciality. So she became a carer for people with learning difficulties and mental health, but more learning difficulties. And again, it was really tough for me to see that in many aspects. It was tough for me, it was tough for her, of course, because she was the one doing the job, but as a child it was tough for me in multiple aspects. One, it meant that she worked extremely long hours, and because of that I couldn't spend as much time with her. Two, it meant that she often was beaten and verbally or physically abused by the service users, which was so hard for me to see as her child. and a protective child. So there were so many elements to it that was really, really difficult. Growing up, my mum would occasionally speak about my father, but I just didn't want to hear it. All I knew was that he had left us, and that's kind of all I needed to hear. But even so, I remember when I would often slag my dad off, that's such an English phrase, but when I often would slag my dad off, my mum would still say to me, hey, he's still your father, so you need to respect him. But I didn't care, I didn't. I remember there were certain things like, I have naturally wavy hair and my mum has dead straight hair, so I'd envy her hair. And then she's like, oh, you get your curly father from your dad. And I was like, great, thanks, Dad. And there were certain habits that I do, like even to this day, it's going to sound so weird, but I have this thing where I guess it's like an OCD. I just don't like things around my mouth. Like if I'm eating particularly and I get sauce on my mouth, it bothers me. So like I have to have like a serviette or tissue around me, a napkin. And I often dab after every bite. I hate having crumbs. Like a croissant, as much as I like a croissant, like it's the worst thing for me because it's flaky, it's crumbly, and no. And so I've just got this really weird OCD. And my mum said like my dad used to do that. And bear in mind, I've never ate a meal with my dad ever in my life. Obviously, like when I was a baby doesn't count. I don't have any recollection of sitting at a family table having a sit down meal with him ever. So for me to have acquired this weird habit, and my dad did the same thing, it just weirded me out. So whenever my mum used to point this out, she wasn't pointing it out in like a malicious way, but she'd point it out and I'd be like, I don't want to hear it, Mum. Like I don't want to be linked to that guy, But the first actual interaction I had with my father, and I still remember it to this day, was one night our phone rang. And this is the time that we used to have house phones. I don't know if you guys had the same experience, but when my mum used to pick up the phone, just from the way she would respond and talk, I would instantly know who it was on the other end of the line. So for example, I would know if it was my auntie, or I would know if it was a neighbour, and not just because she was saying their name, by the way, that would be obvious, but just from the tone or the content of the conversation, I'd be like, oh, it must be so-and-so, it must be so-and-so. But this one particular occasion, I was about 7 or 8, I want to say, and I remember my mum responded to this person and there was familiarity, but I couldn't identify who she was speaking to on the other end of the line, and something about it just made the hairs on my arm stand up. And after speaking to this person for a while, she suddenly held the receiver just to cover the mouthpiece, and she said to me, Deborah, it's your father. He wants to know if he can see you. He's already in London. Just to point out at this stage of the story, my father had gone to the US. That's where he had, I'll try not to swear, but that's where he had fudged off to. So the fact that he was already in the UK, it was quite significant. So I remember saying, yes, I will see him. But even in my young mind at the time, when I was like 7 or 8, I didn't think ooh, opportunity to get close to daddy. My first thought was, I want to see the guy that had the nerve to leave my mum. Honestly, that was all I thought about as a kid. So I agreed to meet this guy. And to be honest with you, I remember meeting him during that period, but I don't even remember our first meeting. It can't have been that significant. All I do remember about that period, that short period, is my dad just being in awe of the girl or the person I had grown into and become, and just saying to my mum how much of a good job that she had done, and just trying to spoil me. I remember us going to these shops like Debenhams. I don't know if any of you, those of you who are in the UK, you remember Debenhams. But back in the days when Debenham was the department store to go to, yeah, my dad would just take me around Debenhams and be like, oh, do you want this? Do you want this? Do you want this? And I'd be like, no, thank you. No, thank you. Because even at that age, of course, I was tempted to say yes, because my mum was a single parent. We were doing way better and managing, day-to-day life, but my mum still wasn't in a position to afford little luxuries like fancy toys or fancy coats and clothes. So of course, as a child, it was tempting for me to say yes, but even again at that age, I didn't want to have anything from my dad. I was just so still angry, I think, at him. I was polite to him, I wasn't rude to him, because what you have to realize is I was grown up with Korean etiquette, which is about being polite to your elders, and regardless of whether he was my biological father or not, he was still my elder. So I was still very, very polite to him, would use the formal language with him, but you know, there was very much visibly a distance between us, and I didn't feel any connection with him, because to me he was like a stranger. And I remember at one point he came to our local church, and I remember like it was rows of seats, so you have a row of seats and we were on one row. And I remember at one point like sitting next to my mum, and my dad was on the other side of her, and he looked very happy. And I remember like looking over at one point and almost for a split second just allowed myself to think, could this be our life? Could this be a family? Could this work again? But again, in that moment, I was too realistic as a child, and I knew that it wouldn't happen. So thereafter, my dad went back to the States, and he kept in touch with me more frequently. Well, I say more frequently. Prior to that, there was no contact whatsoever. And to be honest, I don't even know to this day how he got a hold of our house number, but I think it's because the Korean community was so small back then. It still is small, but it was even smaller back then. And so because they had mutual friends, probably they passed on the contact details when my dad contacted them to ask where my mum and I were. Anyway, so he went back to the States. He started to like send birthday, Christmas cards and gifts, mainly like sweets, and sometimes, I think one occasion, a bit of cash. But to me, again, it was just all meaningless. It's like, what's the point? And at this point, by the way, guys, he hadn't even apologized to my mum. He still hadn't apologized. There's still no proper explanation of why he left, what he's doing, what his future plans were. My dad is a very secretive person. He's always been secretive. He still is secretive. So there was no real explanation. I remember having this kind of back and forth telephone conversation with him, but where he would call me, like I didn't have his number, he would call me. He had my address, I didn't have his address, and he would call me, and when he would call, I would speak for an hour or so. Like it was never a short conversation. It was mainly my dad talking at me, and he would be talking about religion, and I just found it like really annoying, because like even if my mum would talk to me about religion or Christianity, like I'd find it annoying because I was a kid. But at least my mum had a right to teach me or lecture me, whereas I didn't feel my dad had that right in the slightest. And with every conversation, it would always end the same way, like, do you love me? Do you miss me? Do you want to see me? You know, and I would always respond with yes, but only because I felt obliged to respond like that, again, with the etiquette in mind and my own character, where I was more worried about upsetting somebody else than my own feelings. So I'd always just say yes, but it was really forced answer because it wasn't true. And one time we had a conversation, and it was quite early on into the conversation. Like I said, our conversations normally lasted about an hour, and then this particular phone call, it was very like early on into the phone call, and then suddenly I remember hearing a baby cry in the background. And by the way, again, being a kid, I knew realistically my dad would have remarried, found somebody new, had a child, etc. Because at the point that my parents separated, they would have been in their like mid to late 30s at most. So of course I wasn't dumb. I knew my dad would remarry, find a new person, have another child or children. And so when I heard this baby cry in the background, it didn't shock me in the slightest. But my dad was so nervous, and the way he reacted just confirmed to me that it was his child. So he's like, oh, he just panicked, like, I've got to go, I'll call you another time, and just hung up the phone call earlier than he normally would. And then another occasion, I remember my dad asking me if I'd like to come to the States to visit him. I think at the time he said he was in Orlando. I don't even know if this was true, by the way. I just doubt and question everything my dad has ever told me. But he had asked me if I wanted to come to the States. And by the way, you know, when you're a kid, you love Disney, and when you think of the States, all you think about is Disney World, Universal Studios. I don't even know if Universal Studios existed back then, but Disney World I think did, but maybe both did, I'm not sure. And in my naive child mind, like, oh, it would have been so exciting to go to the States. And I was like, yeah, I'd love to go. And I said it like just assuming naturally that my mum would be coming with me. And then at some point in the conversation, I quickly realised that my dad meant that he was just going to send a ticket for me and not for my mum. And I was like, oh, but what about mum? And he was like, no, your mum's, she wouldn't be coming. I'm not sending a ticket for her. I'm just going to send a ticket for you. And then I was like, no, definitely not. Like, and do you know what? Like, that hurt me so much because I felt like it was my dad rejecting my mum again for a second time. So that didn't happen. Then around the age of, I want to say 11-ish, my dad called me and he was like, I don't know, he was just talking to me about his usual crap, to be honest. And I don't know what it was about that day. I think I just had enough. Something just snapped in me. And I remember just blurting out, do you know what? I don't love you. I don't miss you. And I don't want to see you. In fact, I don't even know who you are. And I remember I was crying as I was saying this. I was around 11. And the first thing that my dad said to me, you know, as a kid, I was his kid, I was crying. He could have said anything to reassure me. He could have said anything. And the first thing he did was accuse my mum of, like, brainwashing me. And he was like, what has your mum been telling you? What has she said? And I just hung up the phone. Then he called back again, like, what's wrong with you? What's wrong? And I hung up the phone. And that was the last time I heard from my dad so that was about 11, until I was about 33 years old. So more on that in a bit. One thing I wanted to say was during this time period where I'd gotten to know my dad, which is, like I said, the dates are hazy, but around the ages of 7 to 8 to about 11, at some point during that time, my mum had decided to become a English teacher in Korea. And at the time, she just didn't think it was going to be financially viable to take both of us. And more importantly, she knew it would impact my education in the UK. So she made a really hard decision to leave me behind with her sister, who was my auntie, who at this point had come to the UK. So my auntie came shortly after my mum into the UK. And my auntie is my mum's younger sister because my mum's the eldest. So at this point, my auntie was already married to my uncle and had 2 kids who were my 2 cousins who were both boys. And my auntie had agreed to look after me so that my mum could then go to Korea, earn some money and come back. At the time, I didn't know how long my mum would be gone for. And honestly, it was the hardest time of my life. Like, so many things happened during that time. That is another conversation, another video, but it was probably the worst time of my life. And at the time, I didn't know when I said goodbye to my mum at the airport how long it would be. But I think it ended up being about 9 months, I want to say, maybe a year. And after that time, I eventually told my mum I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't be there, and I wanted to see her. And then at that point, she was financially a bit more independent, I guess. So she was able to earn a bit more money. So she sent for me to come out to see her. And I went to Korea, and I think I was there for a couple of months, to the point where I even went to school in Korea for a short period of time. But I want to say it's just for a couple of months, but that was a whole nother interesting experience as well. So, I mean, I can't even say that I lived in Korea because I didn't really. Like, I lived there for a few months. It just felt like an extended holiday. And then shortly after that, my mum finished her contract with the school that she was working at, and then we both flew back to the UK. So that all happened in between the time that I knew my dad. And by the way, I know it's supposed to be in chronological order, but my mum had this job and everything else. And then after that, she became a carer in the UK, because that ended up being her main job for a long, long time. I was about 11 when I stopped talking to dad. And then my mum pretty much started the carer role when I started like high school, around that age. So in the UK, people start high school around, I want to say 12, 13 until the ages of 16. So that's around the time that my mum became a carer, and that's where she was working super hard. So you can see, like, all our life, my mum has been just working so hard. So at some point, she actually was able to save enough money to actually buy the flat that we were living in off the council. So it actually became a private apartment. My mum did that all by herself, all through hard work, all through her dedication. You know, she was a taxpayer. And that's really the ideal immigrant situation where someone comes over, is given a chance by the government to have a better life, and then they eventually start contributing back to the government and the country. My mum worked her arse off. She really, really, really did, and really did difficult, tough jobs that not a lot of people want to do back then or these days. And then obviously I went to high school. Thereafter I went to college, or sixth form, which is different to the States. I know States call university college, but college for us is after high school, from the ages of about 16 to 18, and then from 18 we go to university for normally 3 to 5 years. So like I said, I was living in that apartment or flat until I was 18 years old. So my dad had from 11 to 18 to reach out to me, to call me, to write to me. He didn't at all. And then after that, we moved house. So we moved house out of London to Hertfordshire, and I went to university in the Surrey area. So I was at uni for 3 years, and I primarily lived at uni, and my mum lived in Hertfordshire, and I would obviously like go back and forth just to see her during the like holidays, I guess. We then moved from an apartment to a house, and I remember like that was such a huge thing for us. Another thing as well I forgot to mention, sorry, it's like I'm trying to tell you the story chronologically, but there's stuff that I keep forgetting which are quite important. Around the age of 10 or 11, I want to say, my mum met my stepfather for the first time. As I said before, my mum was always like defending my dad, saying don't speak about your dad like that, he's still your father, respect him. But after that last phone conversation where I was devastated, she came home and I was crying my eyes out, and she's like, what happened? And I told her. She was just so angry, and I think at that point she was like, do you know what, I'm done. So after that, like, she didn't say anything if I slated him or anything like that. And then anyway, so she met my stepfather, and for me it was so hard to adjust to having a stepfather, because until that point it was always just me and her, like we were the dream team. And suddenly my stepfather coming in, it was again a very, very difficult time for me. By the way, my stepfather is still around, they're still together, and we're fine. But at the beginning, I've really struggled with having a step parent for a long time, for different reasons, but for a long time. And maybe I will do an episode on step parents one day, but I just don't want to address that right now. Otherwise this will be like a 3-hour video. So anyway, my mum met my stepfather, and then, like I said, we went from the apartment in northwest London to Hertfordshire. Then I was going to university at the time, kind of going back and forth to see, you know, my mum during the holidays. And, you know, it was a pretty good life. Like, from going from a council flat to buying the property off the council, we went to a house, and it just really felt like we felt stable for the first time. Living in a council estate, it's not the easiest. Like as I got older, the council estate got worse. Like more and more horrible people came in, and more dodgy people came in, and it became more unsafe to live in, actually. By the time we moved to Hertfordshire, which is quite a quiet, quaint area, we just felt safer. I mean, it had its own problems with like mainly white Caucasian people being there, and that's a whole nother thing. But other than that, you know, we were in our first house, and it felt like our proper first time that we had a home. And it was just a testament to my mum working really hard, and yeah, so we were happy. And I still remember the first time I went to uni, my mum dropped me off and she said, I've got one thing to say. And I was like, yes, mum, because I honestly thought she was going to say study hard, study. But as she dropped me off, the one thing that I'll never forget that she said to me was, just have fun. And that meant a lot to me. It really, really, really did. And thereafter, my mum kind of changed. She just became a lot softer. She became a lot more relaxed, and we started to become closer as a result. I just found her more approachable, and I just appreciated her more, especially living away from home. And I might have taken her words of have fun a bit too much to heart, because I really did have a lot of fun at uni. There was a whole nother situation at uni, and a whole nother experience in meeting someone who was a toxic person. And again, that's another story. And in fact, I kind of covered it when I spoke about domestic violence, which again I'll link down below for anyone who's interested in hearing that story. I lived at uni, and then after that I kind of lived independently for a while, here, there, mainly in West London. And then we moved all together to southwest London, to the area that we're living in now, and we lived together as a family to an even bigger house. And like, honestly, our life just sort of went from strength to strength to strength. And I'm not rich in the slightest, but I'm definitely in a situation where we're comfortable. So it did kind of feel like a rags to riches story, and it was really a testament of, if you put your mind to it and really work hard, you can achieve so much if you have the right mindset. And I certainly wouldn't have the life that I do now if it wasn't for my mum. I certainly wouldn't have the principles that I do now, or the moral code, if it wasn't for my mum. And she just, to this day, teaches me to always be a better person. And my mum could easily have felt so bitter about everything that happened with my dad. Again, with my dad, there's so much more to it. Way more. Like, I honestly think if I told you guys everything that my dad did and said, you would be like, okay, he's cancelled. But even so, my mum, she just raised me so well. And no matter how much my dad hurt her, she to this day says to me, yes, your dad nearly broke me, but I will never regret marrying him because it meant I have you. And I will never regret having you. You are like my everything. She is just such a powerful woman, so independent, so gracious, so forgiving. She's got the biggest heart. I love the fact that she's so sassy, and she always stands up to people that do wrong. She defends those who are weak and vulnerable. By the way, after being a carer for people with learning difficulties, she ended up being given a chance and being sponsored to do a degree. So she did a degree in a foreign language, which was English, in a foreign country in the UK. At the age of like 50, she did a degree in nursing, of all things, and she did it. She passed with flying colours, and she became a qualified nurse for people with learning difficulties. And she did that for a long time before retiring. So I really, really respect my mum. She's like the definition of, I don't know. Comment down below. Your mum is the definition of blank. What would you feel that blank with knowing my story and knowing her story? So just a little bit about my dad, back to my dad. So as I said to you, the last time we spoke was when I was about 11. And then all of a sudden, during the pandemic, I think that was when I was about 33-ish, my dad suddenly got in touch out of the blue. And it was out of the blue because it was like 20 years, 2 decades since I'd heard from the damn man. Oh, the pandemic was a really, really tough time. Like, I lost friends, I made friends, I regained old friends, random waste men, family members came back to me, like my father. Initially, my mum was really worried about my dad getting back in touch with me, because she said to me, if your dad hasn't changed, he's likely to let you down and hurt you. Now, I'm not naive to that. Even though I don't know my dad, I feel like I know him. I feel like I read people quite quickly and easily, and I knew that. But I wanted to give my dad a chance. I really, really did, because as much as I'm a tough shell on the outside, or seem like I'm a tough shell on the outside, I really do like to give people chances, because you never know, and life is too short. And that's something that certainly the pandemic taught me, and all of us, I hope. But my dad just continued to make it about him, and he just wouldn't answer any of my questions. He just dodged and darted around all my questions, answered what he wanted to answer, shared what he wanted to share. And then when I asked him questions, and by the way, I asked him very graciously, I tried to not be rude, I was very fair, but my dad actually had the audacity to say to me, it feels like you're a detective that has been looking for a criminal for a long time and interrogating me. And when my dad said that to me, I was like, wow, okay, you really haven't changed. Because if you think that you can come into my life without any form of explanation and think that I'm just going to open my arms up and, you know, smother you in a hug, you're wrong. I would like to smother you, but not in a hug. So I was just like, wow. And when I heard that, I thought, wow, you really haven't changed. You really haven't changed. It was during this time that my dad actually revealed that he had been an orphan, which was the first time I had heard this. It's the first time, and it kind of explained his, if you can't cope with Deborah, give her up to an orphanage. Not that it makes it okay, but it kind of explained, like, if he was just discarded like that and put up for, adoption at an orphanage, it kind of explained why he might think adoption or orphanages is like a no big deal. Like, it happened to me, therefore you can throw her away too. It explained a little bit, but at the same time, it really didn't. And actually, he kind of kicked himself up his own bum, because you would think that someone who had grown up being discarded, being in an orphanage, not receiving the parental love and care that they should have, and most people who have grown up in abnormal family situations and, not the usual nuclear family templates, you think they would turn around and be like, you know what? When I grow older, I'm going to make sure that I give my child the love I never received. I'm going to make sure that I give my child the stability I never had. I'm going to make sure they grow up in an environment that I was never given. You would think that would be the case, and it is the case with most people, but my father, no. So it speaks volumes about his character. And there's a reason I'm telling you this, because it's not like a slating session, because trust me, if I wanted to get into slating, would be here all day. And then after that, my dad sort of like disappeared again. He just stopped responding to me. What can I say? That's just who he is. It's exactly what my mum said he would do. It's exactly what I thought he would do, which is just let me down, be flaky as hell, if I want to be polite, him being flaky. The one good thing is, whilst he was still responding, I asked if I had any half siblings, because I'm not naive to the fact that he would have remarried, had kids, etc. And he did reveal that I had one brother called David, who was 25 at the time and lived in the States. But I knew that my dad, that's all he would give me. He didn't give me any more information about him, just an age, a number, just a location, the United States of America, which doesn't exactly narrow it down, and the name David, which is very generic. So at the time when my dad stopped contacting me, I was like, why did this guy do this again to me? At a time when I had completely forgotten about his existence and was just happy living my life, he just come in, rocked the boat, unsettled me again. And when I say that, I mean, like, back in the past when I would watch like videos or TV or films, like, of course, if there was a scene or a discussion or a deep thing with the father, like, of course it would make me think of my situation with my dad, but it didn't really make me emotional. Like, I was just like, it is what it is, that kind of attitude. But after my dad had kind of tried to re-enter my life and left, I don't know, it just opened Pandora's box and it triggered something in me. And I thought I was okay, but clearly I wasn't. And so when I would watch TV, films, documentary, even reality TV shows, for the love of God, there were really deep discussions with fathers, children having discussions with their fathers about something, good or bad. I would just bawl my eyes out every single time, I saw that. And I was like, what the hell has he done to me? What was the point of him coming into my life? And I realised that point was to find my half-brother David. And I know the story is supposed to be about, like, my mum being a single parent, like how she raised me, how I grew up. But, it's kind of part of this story, because I do want to share something positive from this story. A happy ending, as you may say. Around the time I was questioning, like, why did my dad do this? I realised, like, actually it was to find my brother. And I was like, what am I going to do with this information? Like, I have three very generic three pieces of information that's very hard to find anybody. And a friend of mine suggested, like, why didn't you try to find him? And I was like, I don't know what to start. So I thought, okay, let me start on Facebook. And I remember typing his name in, and I thought the good thing about guys, generally speaking, is that even if they marry, their surname stays the same. Whereas, with women, again, nowadays, women can do what they like. And so I just remember typing in David's full name into Facebook. There were like so many Davids with this name, and in the States. So I was like, how do I find this guy? Because there's so many Korean Americans, there's hardly any Korean British, especially in my generation and my day, but there were so many Davids. And yet, out of all the profiles, there was one that I just kept coming back to, and I was like, something. It wasn't even his looks or anything. It wasn't like that. It was like, there's something about him that my gut feeling was telling me, that's him. That's your David. So I remember just being like, do you know what? I'm going to bite the bullet. And I wrote a Facebook Messenger message to him, writing, this is going to sound so random. I'm looking for a relative and I wondered if you were him. Is your dad's name blah, 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 all of this. Sent it, and I was like, ugh, treated my laptop like a bomb. I was like, ugh, just chucked it to the side. So I felt so nervous. And then around like an hour or less than an hour later, I got a response from him. And he was like, yep, that's me, basically, confirming it. And I was like, wow. I think my first initial reaction was emotion. I just cried. Like, I just remember feeling really emotional. And then I wrote back to him saying, like, I'm really sorry if you don't know, or if you ever knew, but I'm your half sister. Don't know if you knew of me. And he just said, like, I knew of you. I didn't know your name. I didn't know where you were, but I knew I have a half sister. So if David had tried to find me, there's no way he could have found me unless Jesus literally led the way and like just pointed at me. But I was so lucky to be able to find David, and thereafter just kept in touch, writing messages, etc. Then in January this year, I got to meet him finally in person, and he's married already to his childhood sweetheart. I know, like, meeting a family member that's sort of like a stranger in a way can be daunting, and it can go wrong in many ways, but really in our situation, I feel like it was like better than I could have ever hoped for or prayed for. And when I went to Korea in June, he and his wife and his in-laws were kind of in Korea at the same time, and it wasn't planned. Like, we just had our own schedules and we happened to meet. So we met again quite a few times and spent quite a bit of quality time together, and I just feel like it's brought us closer. So every time I question, like, I don't know why my dad came into my life to be disruptive. Now I know the reason. It was just to meet David. It was worth every painful experience and painful interaction I had with my dad just to be able to find my half brother, because we're both only children and we both grew up with single mums for a period of time, and then we're step parents, and we have a lot in common. And I feel like finally I have a sibling, a younger brother, and it's so meaningful to me. It really, really is. It's like the light at the end of a dark tunnel. My mum and I, she was super close. Like I said, she worked so hard as a nurse until retirement, and now she's living in Korea since the pandemic. And I am just so thankful that I've got all these sort of like individual people in my life, especially my mum, who, like I said, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for her. Like, mentally, I struggled with so many things in my life where I had really difficult childhood. Like I said, there were some things which I don't really want to talk about in this video because it's already been super long. So thank you if you're still here and listening. But I just wouldn't be on this earth if it wasn't for my mum. I wouldn't be on this earth if it wasn't for God and my faith. So I'm really just so thankful. And yes, it was a tough life, it was a tough upbringing, and I wouldn't want to relive any of it. But at the same time, it's made me who I am today, and I wouldn't have it any other way. I wouldn't want any other mum, because she genuinely is like the best mum ever. So I have, like I said, so much respect for her, so much respect for her tenacity, her gracefulness, her strength. I know most parents are amazing, but to all the single mums out there, I so in awe of you. Like, I just salute you so much. I really do. I really salute you. And to all the people who may or may not resonate with my story about not growing up with a father, and I don't mean through death, I mean, through being abandoned or, not having a close relationship with your father. I hear you, I see you, and I just hope that you had someone in your life like I did with my mum, or now like I do with my husband, that just fills that hole for you, that makes you feel complete without the need for that father figure, if that makes sense. I also feel like my faith, like I said, my religion and believing in God and having, a heavenly father, it really helped me to feel whole in a way that I perhaps wouldn't have if I didn't have my faith. Yeah, there are so many things I'm thankful for, but I really, really, really appreciate you listening. I know it was a way longer episode this time, and I know it wasn't easy, and I got very emotional at times, so thank you for bearing with me. But part 2 will be on the same topic, the F word, and I will share the perspective of a guest who I've already got in mind, and hopefully she'll be able to share more about her life, but I won't say too much because I want it to be a surprise too and interesting. So thank you so much for listening. Thanks once again for all your support, your words of encouragement, your kindness, and I hope to see you on part 2. Take care.